Hello, welcome to Bite Me Fanboy, a comics podcast. I'm Kate.
I'm Tom.
I'm Jordan.
I'm Kirsten.
And today we're going to be talking about Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. So let's dive in. Really quick, right up front, I want to mention that there are swastikas in the comic book that we're going to be talking about today. They are on pages 27 and 127. So if that is something that you have an issue with or understandably are upset with, just look out for those pages 27 and 127. Protect your mental health. So I'm going to throw it to Tom really fast, and he can kind of give a quick review of why we chose this particular comic/book.
So one of the things to fundamentally understand about this book is that it was written in the 90s. It is not like the most recent thing. However, it is a book that is extremely influential on comics. It's the best way I could describe it is I had a college professor who said, not everything in this book needs to be right, but enough people who read this book have gone on to create stuff with this book in mind. So as a result, it's basically kind of a primer on how comics operate as a medium. And it was something that I had to read in college. It's something that I've seen also assigned in high school classes when discussing how to read graphic novels. And Scott McCloud's also been like making consistently more and more discussions of comics while also making his own creative work at the same time. So if you've ever heard of the 24-hour comic, that's a Scott McCloud thing. He's also one of the least problematic people who signed the Creators' Bill of Rights. He's still pretty active in the comic scene. And one thing I do want to say also, just because it is a 90s book, it does not discuss the nature of webcomics, but in his book, I believe it's Revolutionizing Comics, which is the third one in this series. This is the first. It does talk a lot about using the internet to create an infinite scrolling comic, and he basically pitches what Webtoon is nowadays. So I think it's very interesting, and he is like someone who is trying to keep up with the times. It's just I'm not about to tell my friends, second episode of the podcast, let's read 3 different textbooks, college textbooks on comic books.
I appreciate that. Jordan, what are your thoughts?
So I will say it read and had a lot of similarities between the textbooks I was reading in my theater design classes. So a lot about color spacing, how stories are set up, how you see an image and are able to kind of pick it apart. So it felt very much like a textbook to me, but a good textbook, and one that was easy to understand. You didn't get bogged down in it, but he was able to get.
I agree. I thought it was very dense. Like it was, I don't know if I was expecting that denseness, and it was quite textbooky.
I did like at the beginning where he was talking about the definition he was going to use for comics. I think that was how his introduction of that and the introduction in the book kind of set me up to expect that it was going to be more of a like classroom book.
That's actually a very good point, and part of it is that discussion of the definition of comics. He starts out with talking about, well, what's a comic versus just a picture or all that sort of thing, and his discussion of sequential art in sequence, telling a story, and that whole definition that he's pulling from Will Eisner's work. Eisner is one of the most influential comic book creators out there. He created The Spirit. He designed a huge amount of stuff. The Eisner Awards are obviously named after him. He was previously the guy who wrote the definitive textbook on comics, which is called Comics and Sequential Art. So he's kind of trying to give you a crash course in talking about Will Eisner and then moving to his discussion and his theory.
For people who are not familiar with the Eisner Awards, it's the award given for creative achievement in American comic books. I believe it's given out at San Diego Comic-Con every year. I have heard, I don't know if it's still the case, that you don't need a special ticket to go. You just need a badge for San Diego Comic-Con, and you can just walk in. and go to the awards.
Is that like the Dragon Awards at Dragon Con? Is it similar?
It's a bit bigger as a lot of the awards go. The best way I could describe it is a huge level of like industry recognition. It is a major validation and recognition of a lot of people's creative work.
I see. Kirsten, do you want to jump in?
I thought it was a lot. It definitely was a tough textbook. I thought he used more language than he needed to get his point across. I mean, I liked parts of it. I thought it was interesting, but it just kind of felt repetitive after a while, as textbooks do. But I really thought the parts that were interesting was like when he was comparing and contrasting how manga is different from comics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part I really liked and paid the most attention to.
Yeah, McCloud starts really like, okay, this is someone who has never heard of a comic. Let me explain what that is.
Yeah,
Yes.
I noticed that too. Just like very basic. Also, what I found really interesting was when he starts talking about how comic books and comics in general had a stigma attached to them, like in early years. And
Oh, yeah.
They still kind of do.
They still do, but not to the same extent. The infamous Wortham, the guy who, Frederick Wortham, who was part of the Comics Code hearings, if you read the transcripts from his hearings, there is a huge discussion about how it is implicit with the idea of anyone being, anyone being a comic reader, they are a child, which is why they needed regulation, per his statements.
oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, there was no assumption. Like, it was literally, no, of course it's a kid. What do you mean? Like, do other people other than kids read comics? And there were, like, other people other than kids read comics. It's just, this was kind of, that was the tactic to get a moral panic going, honestly.
I see.
That's how you get the moral panic going, is you make sure everybody is afraid of something hurting children.
I kind of wanted more analysis of that because he just kind of was like, oh, yeah, there's a stigma attached to comic books. And like, I don't even remember if he said like, and it continues today, like moving on. But I kind of wanted more of that, like an analysis of like, well, who is perpetuating this stigma and like, has it changed over time? Like, what do we think now? But there wasn't really a lot there.
That goes very much into like the history of comics. I have a book that I could recommend actually for this show. It might be worth doing, which is called The Comic Book History of Comics. The issue with that is, you talked about this book being dense.
Oh
no. Like that book took me several days to read, and it's, I think actually, if it isn't shorter than Understanding Comics, it sure feels like it.
I'm marking this.
Like in terms of pages.
I'm marking it down to put in the show notes. You said it was what? What was it called?
It's called The Comic Book History of Comics. It is a comic book that discusses the history of comics, mostly in America. It does talk about like what's going on in the world at the same time. So when like they're like, yeah, and this is the time when Osamu Tezuka was doing his work that would define manga. Like that's, they have that in there.
That actually sounds really cool.
It is. It's also, I don't know how to say it other than it requires a lot more like buy-in and time to get through. I say this as someone who loves that book. Well, we'll get to it one day and you'll understand. You'll be like, yeah, you're right. Yep, okay. It's like that.
Okay, so then, I also wanted to, so Scott McCloud mentions the kind of like the idea of faces and objects, right? Like how humans see faces and objects. Mm-hmm. Just a quick fact check. So this specifically is called the pareidolia phenomenon. And it's where like, you can see patterns or faces in inanimate objects. And he says it's a very uniquely human trait, but that's actually not correct. We see this also in non-human primates. They also can see faces in in inanimate objects, not just humans. So I just wanted to fact check that really quickly.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point because like so much of his stuff involves discussing uh human perception, and it is, yeah, I mean, it is anthropocentric in like, the basic definition.
Yeah, like I understood where he was coming from and like you want to create this bond with the reader. Um but this is also kind of what I found prevalent throughout the whole book was that he lacks sources for things that he claims. So like no citing of sources, which is kind of strange given that this does read like a textbook. And number 2, he's taking from so much, like there's psychology, there's science, there's art history, and it's just like I kind of wonder how qualified he is to speak on all of that.
Yeah, actually, very, very good point. A lot of times you'll see somebody, a lot of creators end up having this take on their theory of art and all that sort of thing. And well, it's someone who's a creator. It's not a researcher. So there's going to be, I guarantee you, there's going to be some, more than some. There's probably going to be plenty of just situations where he's not able to portray something correct of science. He's just talking about his individual experience, and of course, also, I mean, as far as I know, the guy is neurotypical, and I think that also does influence how he talks about some things.
Yeah. I also wrote down that I think he's at his best when he's kind of applying art history and analyzing that kind of like within the comics medium. So like when he was drawing on like the Egyptian hieroglyphics and talking about like how art has evolved over time within like kind of a comics medium. I thought that was really fascinating.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of interesting discussion. That's one of the things at the very early at the beginning where he talks about a lot of that sort of stuff. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of interesting stuff when it comes to it, because that also is part of how he's able to find definitions for what a comic actually is, because there is a history behind it. It's not something that just started, back at the 1800s. One of the other things, actually, it's always very interesting just to mention, and it's something that most, like, if you say it, people will be like, oh yeah, obviously, it's just they hadn't thought about it, or at least Americans, but manga did not start with the Osamu Tezuka style. Manga was just literally Japanese comics and cartooning. And if you look at pre-Tezuka manga, it looks very different, just because he kind of codified an artistic style that was extremely influential for a whole country.
I would like to read this quote from Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. It's considered normal in this society for children to combine words and pictures so long as they grow out of it. I don't believe that is true today, and I don't believe that was kind of ever true. I think that that is a very, like you had mentioned before, kind of like a neurotypical perspective, because in my work with disabilities and like children who have disabilities, that statement kind of seems a bit ableist to me, because a lot of children that I've worked with who have disabilities, they communicate through drawings or pictures or signs. Like they don't communicate verbally. A lot of them are nonverbal. And so any way that they can communicate their needs or their wants, which includes, pictures or AAC devices. So like buttons that you can press that have pictures on them, anything like that. I think that that's easier for the person with a disability as well as for their caregiver or their loved ones or their families. Maybe this is getting into like kind of like murky waters here, but I think that his statement, I admit that this book was written in the early 90s, so maybe he wasn't aware, but I think that there's a bunch of different ways that we can communicate, and I don't know if that was quite correct.
I don't think he was speaking in terms of child development. I think he was speaking mostly in terms of, like, again, that stigma of comics related to kids. And of course, again, that it's very neurotypical. He's not thinking about it in terms of that sort of thing.
So just for a typically developing child, it's it's normal in this society for children to combine words and pictures as comic books like we know them today, as long as we grow out of it because of that stigma. Okay, I understand. I was just kind of like,
it's much more in terms of like children will draw a picture and have words in it, but like when we want to see them develop as artists, we have them communicate or they're not communicate, but perform their art as one or the other, but not both.
but see, this is another point that I wish he kind of like expanded upon, because this goes back to the stigma. And it's like, well, then do you like if people wanted their children to like pursue an art career, they would only nurture that artistic part of their child's development, or like, you know, I don't know. I just think that it's interesting that like, would you encourage your child to be like, oh yeah, you can read and write and do your writing, but not combined with pictures? That cannot be combined. Like, how would you go about trying to kind of encourage your child's, artistic efforts, but then also keep it separate,
That's a very it's interesting. Just kind of it's very much from a specific time, I think, with how people discuss autism, because especially because I was just thinking, I'm like, yeah, I wonder what comics creators would have been like known to be autistic at the time. And I'm like, wait, yeah, this is 1992. That was discussed a very different way. Like,
but when you were talking about separating out words and pictures as art, if you look even at college courses, so like you have art history, but you're looking at paintings. You're not necessarily including written word in that. So your creative writing classes are going to be under the English department. They are technically still under humanities, but they're a different major than an art degree.
See, that's a really good point. Like, that's interesting. And I wonder, do you know when kind of like comics started to become more mainstream as like classes, or like something you could study for in college?
I don't believe my college had comics courses. Even in, I don't know of a creative writing or English class that would have referenced it. Well, okay, never mind. So I was aware of mouse in one of my English classes. So I had my instructor had her family were part of the Hasidic Jews. Am I describing that correctly, Kate? Yeah. And so she had left that to become a teacher. And that was one of the books that she introduced us to in her English course.
Was that in high school, you said?
No, okay. That was in college. It wasn't an entire course on it. That was just one book that we read as part of her course.
I know comics have been in curriculum for a long time, because I know like there have been books that have been individually part of classes. I know was Jules Pfeiffer wrote stuff, I believe in the 60s, was in like he was being studied in art history, like his comic and cartooning was done in relation to like art history. I know when I was in high school in the early 2000s, we had stuff like Mouse, Watchmen, and other books like that in our basically advanced literature classes. College classes for comics started, I think, probably in the 2010s widely, like the widely ones. Now, this is in America. I am not sure about France, because France has a very specific and very different history of how comics work there. Well, France and Belgium, because France wants to call dibs on Hergé, who is Belgian. That's literally why they're Franco-Belgian comics. It's because French comics people want to be considered in the same tradition as the guy who made Tintin.
I like how the French say Tintin. They pronounce it Tonton.
Yeah.
So apparently, one of the first PhDs offered for comics was actually in 1959.
Wow.
It was given to Sol M. Davidson, and he wrote a thesis called Culture and Comic Strips. And then in 2011, a Paris university apparently gave Jean-Christophe Menu, whose name I'm butchering,
Oh, Jean Christophe Menu,
Yes.
I believe.
Yeah, the fancier way of saying it. He got a doctorate in art and art sciences, but his thesis was the comics and its double language and the frontier of comics, practical, theoretical, and editorial prospects. But in the US, apparently the University of Oregon now has a minor dedicated to comics and cartoon studies, and that started in 2012. And Teesside University, which is in England, has a BA for comics and graphic novels that started in 2014, and an MA in comics that started in 2018. And then the University of Lancaster has a PhD in comic studies, and they started that in 2015. Yeah, and there's a comics professor at the Lancaster University and everything.
Kirsten's over
went
here giving us some history.
So in my college years, I had a professor who would teach comics, but straight up, you had to sign a release form because literally he was on a list of reasons to block tenure and get rid of certain professorships because he taught classes on comics. And so he was like, yes, okay, if we're going to discuss comics, we will be discussing things that include, and basically he had to have an entire disclaimer of just controversial subjects that appear in every English class. If you're reading like fiction and literature that is meant for adults, like it's nothing that you wouldn't see in a copy of like Beloved by Toni Morrison, but because of like it being comics, this was in 2014. He's still, I don't know if he has still uses it, but I know he had to do that, just have that release form to keep people in the class because of just how much heat he has gotten in the past.
Wow.
So yeah, that if we're talking about, yes, technically it is a thing. It's just he has had to fight a lot, do all that sort of stuff, and also he also has published entire books and presented lectures on comics. Like he has done all sorts of stuff. It's just because it was comics, he got extra scrutiny. We'll just say it's also something you see nowadays with like the Moms for Liberty and book banning crowd, where they're just like, oh man, there's this book called Blankets, and there's stuff in Blankets that's controversial or gross. And I'm like, man, I read Face at the Edge of the World in high school, which is way worse than anything in Blankets. I've read. Uh, I'm not going to say the name of this book right, but it's excuse me, or pardon me, you're stepping on my eyeball, uh, which is not nearly as gross as it sounds, but still, it's it's a book that's very dark and very grim. It involves a teenager who is in denial about his dad being dead. Spoiler alert for the um this entire time he's been like thinking his dad's writing him letters, and it's him writing himself letters to like send to himself. Um but like there's so much stuff that would normally be in regular literature, and all of a sudden the minute it becomes a comic book and it becomes something with pictures and words, it becomes controversial and it becomes clearly obviously targeted at children. Like also just look at Gender Queer by Mayo Kobabe. Is it Kobabe or Kobab?
I have no idea.
Either way, either way, you look at Gender Queer and the amount of people who are like, this book is for children and it's trying to indoctrinate them into being gay or trans, or speak up roughly at dinner and disagree with their parents. Um, it's a book that's not written for kids. It's a book about an adult reflecting on their childhood, and like there's a lot of stuff in there that I'm not even talking about like, oh, it's adult material. No, it's just stuff that like adults would get and a kid wouldn't. And fundamentally, also, I'm going to just throw this out there. A significant portion of that book is about how Maya did not have anyone to talk to as an adult and an authority figure about these subjects, and because of that, that's why they had so much trouble. And maybe if adults were more open to talking to kids about this, Maya wouldn't have had such a hard time. And also, that means the book genderqueer would probably not uh, exist in the form that all these people are hand wringing over. I'm sorry, I'm getting on a soapbox, but like that is also kind of where McCloud is talking about. And the issue is on one hand, that is informing a lot of how he talks about, but you're very right that it's not present in Scott McCloud's books. Or sorry, it's not present enough in Scott McCloud's book that he is able to cover that entire subject.
Yeah. I also think that maybe you guys are the experts here, but I feel like the way that we kind of see comics and graphic novels right now, like it's sort of a new medium. Would that be correct?
That's a good question, honestly. Jordan, do you think comics are a new medium or?
I wouldn't argue that they're new. I mean, TV is newer. Any computers are much newer. Even in his own argument, he's going, well, technically you can look at the old drawings that we're finding on artifacts, and those could be considered comics because they're sequential art that tells you a story.
Right.
So,
but I was thinking more of like, I guess I was thinking more of like academically, because Kirsten's list that she read off, they were so very new, like degrees and classes and like, you know, all of that. Maybe the academic kind of acceptance of comics is new.
Mhm.
The academic field of the comics criticism and comics analysis is, I mean, it's relatively new in that it's maybe like less than a century old, but I was going to say TV, like Jordan said, TV and video games are still younger than that. But I think there is a book that I have not read that I need to. That is called, I believe it's called Arresting Development, involving the discussion of maturity in comic books. It's literally in my to be read list of stuff. And part of it involves discussion of comics as an art form and comics being critically analyzed. And it is all about kind of that question of like, okay, is it new criticism or is it a new field or is it just new to have criticism that's labeled specifically as comics? And I think that is probably something that'd be worth looking at just for this show. I don't know if that's not really a comic book, so I don't know if we'd be putting that on the docket. But I think that is it's a worthwhile thing to discuss when it comes to this sort of stuff because comics aren't necessarily new, but I will say that with both the indie comics revolution, where a bunch of people left Marvel and DC to join up and found indie studios or buoy up existing indie studios, and then also the information revolution with the internet, sending stuff all over the world and allowing us to see stuff in other countries and how they do their art. I think it is changing how we would approach comics and what's covered under comics because like just literally designing a page for time, like to show the progression of time in an infinite scrolling webtoon is so different from on a page. And that is actually something I wanted to bring up is that if you look at webtoon, there's a lot of like empty space if you laid everything out, but it's not meant to be laid out all at once. It's meant to be something that you're on a phone scrolling through with your finger, which is why they leave all this empty space. And that's a very interesting thing compared to the panel layouts that McCloud has with the gutter, where he talks about the gutter being a delineation of time in a comic panel because you don't have that necessarily with webtoons.
That actually segues perfectly into one of the questions I had, which was McCloud kind of talks about like the evolution of comics as an art form, like Jordan and you and I and Kirsten have touched upon a bit. And I was just curious about where you guys see comics kind of where are they going to evolve from here or how will they evolve from here? And also including manga in that, Kirsten, as well. Like, is it going to evolve or like stagnate? Like, what will we be seeing?
I think part of it has been making comics more accessible because I know with being able to access them online, especially with the large catalogs that Marvel and DC have, I can read first editions of comics that have been out of print for years and would cost me hundreds of dollars if I wanted to actually buy a physical copy and read it. And if I was a collector, I might buy that. But if I just wanted to read it, it's fantastic that I can just go on their website and read the comic. And it also gives people who don't necessarily have a comic book store near them a way to access comics.
That's a really good point.
There's something that, like, it because of the age of the book, it really doesn't come up. But I think one of the most interesting things about development of comics was when there was that webcomics boom in the early 2000s. Not everything was great, but not everything had to be great. It was a new venue for people to create and publish comics, tell stories, put stuff out there, uh, create entire weird senses of humor, all that stuff. And it was stuff that specifically did not fit in the business model of the big two or even any of the indies at the time. You had a lot of really interesting creative work being done online. Um, I will always say, like, Achewood would never function like a traditionally published comic. The big outdoor fight, which is really good, is probably the closest it ever gets to traditional comic storytelling. The closest thing I could ever compare it to is Pogo, because like Pogo, Achewood would do all sorts of very specific types of language and turns of phrase to communicate things. But Pogo again was also another very singular thing. I think there are times where we kind of get to see an era of huge amounts of innovation, like in the 70s when we had that huge boom of independent comics and underground comics. That was where you had zine culture kind of evolve in, and you had a lot of people who would come out of it as major comics creators, but not superhero comics. Um, and some of them good, some of them bad, some of them good creators, some of them bad people. But either way, like, that is a hugely influential thing. And I do think that that kind of innovation was inspired by the comics code and the repression that was going on. And so they had to innovate to get around that. And I think the webcomic boom kind of also did the same sort of thing. Awkward Zombie is a comic that could not be made in a traditional medium because of the amount of licensing and everything it would have to get away with just to have all these copyrighted characters they make jokes about in that webcomic. It also would have that same sort of like repressive force. In this case, it would be international copyright. But as a parody comic and all that sort of thing, if you've ever read it, it's very funny. It's very good. One of those comics of that era that I do think holds up. It's just very interesting to see that, like, that could not have been made if it went traditional. And so then now we have Webtoon, which was a great alternative for a very long time. But now that Webtoon has kind of become established in its own thing, I'm thinking there will be something that is coming out trying to break the trend of Webtoon and become its own thing. And I think we're going to see that. And that's probably where the innovation is going to go, because there's going to become some sort of orthodoxy for how online comics are released or something like that. And I do think that things are going to get changed and things are going to get weird. I hope things get weird. That's when we get all sorts of stuff that I'm just like, it's going, yes, yes. That's me every time someone gets like a weird new idea of how to do a comic story.
You reminded me, like, the big webcomic boom of like the early 2000s ish. What was that?
Mm-hmm.
That there was like a webcomic that like all of like the Tumblr kids were obsessed with.
Homestuck. Homestuck is actually probably one of the best examples of innovation in comics. There is so much to be said about Homestuck, and I am not nearly an expert enough on it. I know some experts on Homestuck, and I might have to bring them in if we want to talk about it. I'm totally down for talking about Homestuck because it is such an interesting microcosm of what started out as a little comic with an interactive function using Flash Player, and it became a huge multimedia, transmedia storytelling event, and it was incredibly influential, and especially to other creators. So many creators I know read Homestuck, said, "Oh man, this changes how I think about how I can do my work." And Homestuck fundamentally created a big like artistic shift, and you can see stuff that is a visual reference or visual inspiration from Homestuck in a lot of comics right now, especially the indie stuff. But even I guarantee you, there is at least one Marvel comic that comes out every month that has, or something Homestuck.
Yeah, if we do Homestuck, I don't even know what that is at all.
It's a lot. I would say what we should do is just do like a section of Homestuck, which is why I would want to bring in the expert and be like, okay, if we want to explain Homestuck's influence and how it's creatively special, how would we do that best? Because on one hand, we could start with the very beginning of Homestuck, but that doesn't get into as much of the crazy things that go on.
Okay, well, I want to throw it over to Kirsten now. Kirsten, where do you see comics or manga going from here? How are they going to evolve?
They're probably going to move more and more online. Like there's a bunch of webtoon ish comics already, and many of them are like super mainstream. So there's webtoon and manta and tapas, and a whole bunch more. And then there's been like several apps that have come out that kind of take all the manga scantillation sites and kind of combine it into one digital e-reader, which isn't great for the artist, but it does make it more accessible. So that's probably where it's going. I'm sure like manga is getting more expensive. They're probably going to come out with more of like a collector thing. So have like the omnibus style one, just because it's cheaper per book to do it that way instead of buying individual ones. But it's also interesting because like whenever you go into a bookstore, you see, younger kids all crowded in the manga section. In a way, the younger generation is getting really into it. And you see Barnes and Noble has like a ton of manga in there. And then we have a whole store dedicated to manga near us.
I have a question. So, you know how Jordan and Tom were talking about how you can kind of get like an app or a website that kind of like has a bunch of Marvel or DC or like the different comics online? Is there one that's kind of like that, but for manga?
Kind of, not really. Like I know Katagawa and Shonen Jump kind of have their own thing going. It's not super accessible. And the difference between like American comics versus manga is like, yeah, people appreciate the different publishers, but they don't necessarily like only follow those publishers. They're kind of all over the place. Yeah, so you can buy chapters off of there, and they'll let you read like a chapter to kind of get you into it, but they don't have like Marvel Unlimited where you pay like a certain fee and then you can read all of it. Especially
Right.
since like the stories, unlike Marvel, aren't interconnected like they do in more Western comics. So you're more dedicated to like a whole series than you are, a universe.
That's true. They are different in that respect.
Crunchyroll, I believe, also has manga. I want to say they've decreased a lot of what they used to have. The library has gotten smaller, but that is an option.
Yeah, as Crunchyroll and Sony have bought up more and more of like the anime and manga competition, they've had less incentive to like include being able to read manga in their subscriptions.
So interestingly, because I was looking for several manga on Libby, because I've been reading like a ton of ebooks through the library on Libby, and I could not find like any manga through that app.
I might try Hoopla because Libby is linked to whichever library system you're in. So is Hoopla, but they have a bigger selection typically than one individual library. The caveat is you can only check out 10 items a month.
And Hoopla is an app, is that correct?
Yes, but it's also funded, or like you hook your library card to it, so you don't have to pay for it because you're paying taxes, which pay your library.
Ooh, I'm going to download Hoopla. Thank you.
Yeah, my library does not have monstrous. Hoopla does.
Kind of going off of what Scott McCloud was saying about like, you know, the medium of comics being able to do things that film or like different media can't do. How do you guys think that this medium in particular, so comics and graphic novels, and like specifically looking at like how words plus pictures, how can they influence what kind of stories can be told through this medium?
There's a conversation in his book about the nature of time in relation to reading words. He takes a picture of a party and he says, "Well, if you add dialogue, all of a sudden you have a reading order and it progresses through time. If you have just the picture of the party though and there's no text, there's nothing to read, then you are looking at a frozen moment in time, and just the nature of adding a text box can change how you read time and that sort of thing." And it's a very interesting thing just in terms of how that can convey meaning or feeling, because you can have two repeated panels where someone says a word and then doesn't say anything or vice versa, and all of a sudden you just created an entire infinite pause. There is a pause that can last as long as the reader wants it to, and that's such a interesting thing in terms of how a movie can not do that. A movie doesn't. If you're reading a book, there is always a progression. The most you have to do is like turn a page, and even then, in a comic, turning a page does very different things. Because if you've ever read anything by Junji Ito, part of what makes his stuff work so well is not just, hey, wouldn't it be scary if everything was spirals? It's uh, he has this amazing command of being able to time crazy things happening to when you turn a page. So when you'll be reading something like Uzumaki and there's something scary going down, it will never be on one of like the pages you're looking at. You have to turn the page to see the scary thing. It's a reveal and it's a timing thing that is based entirely on the user opting in to continue something, which is something you can kind of have in video games, but even then, once you just trigger the event, it still has that recorded creator set timing to it. So you can have a lot of really interesting horror and suspense operate in a time frame that does not function with anything else. I've been rereading Immortal Hulk, which is one of my favorite horror comics of all time. Even though it's more science fiction than horror, but it has a lot of interesting horror stuff. And I think part of it is that there's some crazy body horror in it, but other parts of it is it uses the tricks horror comics use to convey the story. There's so many reveals that operate on building tension and then turning a page. And it's so well done in terms of some of the story beats and the reveals. There are so many dramatic reveals in that series. Uh, it, it could be a telenovela. All of it is timed expertly because it has that energy with being able to control its own time frame.
So you mentioned Junji Ito. Is there another author that kind of does the same thing?
There are many authors that do that same sort of thing. Uh, I mentioned, of course, there was the Immortal Hulk, but let's see. You want to see some of that being really fun. One that's really good is to look up old EC comics. Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear. All of those had similar tricks to being able to do those horror and suspense. If we're going to go with something more specific, actually, it's not even horror. If we're looking at the comics for next episode, there are a lot of great dramatic beats that are based entirely on controlling the time frame and having that dramatic moment when someone turns the page and sees what they're looking at or sees who they're looking at, because it's a way of messing with someone's expectations and subverting them.
Okay, that's interesting. Jumping off of that, how do you think that like words and pictures kind of work together in the comics medium? Like, how do they enhance the other, if that makes sense?
I think that if you use one to reinforce the other and then the other to reinforce the one, you get something really additive out of all of it, you know? It's something where you could create something more than the sum of its parts. Yes, you could have the dialogue, and yes, you could have the pictures telling the story, but by combining them all together, you can have some really amazing tricks. Uh, Jordan has mentioned Teen Titans, and you've mentioned Teen Titans. And if you go back and look at those Teen Titans, just the way Raven's dialogue is written, it is not in a normal balloon. It's done in kind of a weird font and a weird style to indicate she talks differently and kind of separate from everybody else. And that is, another really interesting trick to combining the words and the pictures of a comic to create a vibe and a feeling.
Yeah, some of the horror comics, you can get the speech bubbles that they literally draw like they're dripping. So it gives you a feeling of how, if that creature was actually speaking, how it would sound. I would say they've done that in Swamp Thing.
Yeah, I remember that in Sandman. Like he had like kind of different bubbles.
Color, yeah, he's got inverted balloons. They're white text on black background.
Yeah, and then but also like his family all kind of had different ways that they spoke, like you mentioned before, based on like the bubbles and like how the text was written.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things you can find that do stuff like that. And that's just in lettering. That's just straight up in how you depict the text. There are great tricks where you see someone take something that is dramatic and momentous, put it in a big speech bubble, but have it be such a tiny word coming out of it. You create this incredible feeling of impact when you do stuff like that. One of the other examples I would almost say is of how the story can work. In Walter Simonson's Thor, there is a comic. So Simonson actually had to stop doing the illustration for a while because he was going to burn himself out. He was writing and illustrating the comic for quite a while, but he came back to illustrate one issue. And what it is it is an issue where almost every page is a big splash page. So it's one panel, but he designs the panel to be such a thing that it traces your eye around the page to make you follow it like you're following a story. And also he can, supplement that by using dialogue balloons to orient where your eye should start or something like that. And so you end up with sequential art using just a one panel a page format. And it's a really cool design. If you've ever seen pictures on the internet of Thor fighting the Midgard serpent, and it's done in kind of a 70s, 80s Thor style, that's the comic I'm talking about.
I guess finally, I kind of wanted to talk about who we think this book is for, because we both kind of, or not both, we all kind of touched on how it read like a textbook. Like it was very kind of dense and got into the nitty gritty of like the technical aspects of comics. But I wonder if like absolute beginners would be willing to kind of like wade through all of that terminology. And like, who do you think this was written for?
So I think it's probably written for people who are looking to learn about comics in a way to maybe produce them at some time, or to get like a background on how comics have been created in the past. One of the things that I really liked, so Kirsten had mentioned at the beginning how he had talked about the difference between Japanese comics and Western comics. And I liked seeing his graphs on like the panel transition types. That's something, if you're looking to write comics, that would be really helpful, because you can see, okay, so in American comics, we mostly use action to action, subject to subject, and scene to scene transitions, versus Japanese comics tend to use aspect to aspect transitions. That's something that once you know the rules, you can play around with it and create different comics. So I don't necessarily think he was writing for someone who is learning to read about comics. I do think it's a little bit helpful to understand the history, but it's not necessary. I do think this book is very helpful if you're looking to write comics yourself.
That's a really good point, and that's something that I actually didn't even think about.
That does also square real well with how McCloud talks about the internet and digital media being a way to revolutionize comics, because he is talking about it from the perspective of a creator. And then that also goes into some of the stuff about the children doing art, because he's talking from the perspective of someone who is trying to be taken seriously for art that they are dedicated to, but also someone who has been discouraged from doing comics with text, images with text, as an art form.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's actually like a really good point, because I don't remember if it was you guys who I was talking to about this or my brother, but my brother actually read this book in college in one of his classes, and we were talking about it. And I was like, that makes total sense to me, because yeah, it would be offered in college classes for people who want to go into the medium.
Speaking of college, I want to throw this out there. We were talking about studying comics and all that sort of thing. I was at an event years ago for local to our state comics artists, and I met a guy who made a comic that just the themes and the style were exactly catnip to me. It was great. I was just like, yes, I got to get this. So I bought his comic and opened it up, and the comic itself was part of a thesis he did in college. The comic itself was meant to be a artistic work and also examination and example of his understanding of the art form. So I do think that there is some really good uh, just progress and work being done in people trying to study and then also hone comics.
Yeah.
And now that we're back on the topic of comics in college, when Kirsten was reading off the dates, I noticed there was a large gap between 1959 and 2011 when we were talking about the work that was being published in comics. I'm like, I wonder if that had anything to do with the Comics Code, because that was that's very much the era, the 1950s to 2011, I believe, is when it was officially abandoned. I know that Marvel published, Tom, you and I had talked about this, the Spider-Man issue they published without the Comics Code authority designator on the comic book, but well before it was abandoned fully.
Yeah. So something like that. It's just there's going to be anytime we talk about history of comics, there's going to be like shaking our fist at the air, saying Wortham. Of course, it wasn't just Frederick Wortham. He is like the guy who people talk about when they want to talk about the larger issues. Frederick Wortham actually did have some interesting work outside of comics, in that he was actually really big on civil rights related to destroying segregation, which is really great. It just stinks that he also thought that Batman was going to turn you gay. I'm not joking.
Okay. All
Not
right.
joking.
Okay. I don't want to ask. Okay.
Oh, don't worry. Don't worry. You don't need to ask. It will come up.
I do. So, because we keep mentioning the Comics Code, I kind of want to do like a whole episode about it, because I still kind of don't know what it is. Maybe we should
Because if we do comic book history of comics, we just do like three episodes. Pre-Comics Code, the Comics Code, and then after Comics Code.
Oh, the horror comics we could have had.
Okay, I want to put it in the list. All right. Does anybody have any last minute thoughts or anything they want to?
I will say we have pointed out some issues with this book, but we do have to remember the book is over 30 years old.
This is true.
And I will say it's for a textbook for people looking to write their own comics. It is very readable. it is very easy to understand and give people a starting point. And even just here's a couple new people that they might learn about. They might learn about Will Eisner and start looking him up. They might learn about more. They might be interested in more Japanese comics. So it gives people a starting point, even if there are some issues with it.
Yeah, I think that I just went into it not knowing that it was going to be kind of like a textbook. And I was like, oh, it's a comic book. And it's not. So, well, like it is, but it's not. So just kind of like, prepare yourself when you go into it, that it is very dense.
Real understanding comics no, I'm not going to finish saying that. Nope, sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to sign us out unless anybody has anything they want to add. Okay. Thank you for joining us on Bite Me Fanboy, a comics podcast. If you enjoyed this show, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your fellow comic fans. We will see you next time. Bye.